Fran Townsend on the phone with us now to talk about the resignation of President Trump's Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert. Fran, given your experience in a series of White Houses, what is your interpretation of why Mr. Bossert is resigning from the White House at this point?
You know, Vlad, thank you for having me on. It's somewhat surprising. Tom Bossert seems to enjoy a very good relationship both with the president and the vice president. They trust him. They rely on his advice. But, you know, when there's a new national security advisor, there is bound to be some discussion about reporting and roles. I didn't have that problem. I had a very good working relationship with Condi Rice when she was the national security advisor because I had been her deputy previously. And so there was no struggle between us about roles and responsibilities. But inevitably, if you have a new national security advisor come in, whether or not you remain a direct report to the president or whether you report through the national security advisor, what the scope of your responsibility is, whether that includes terrorism or not, is bound to be part of the discussion. And if there's a disagreement, you cannot let that disagreement or that ambiguity stand, and there must be clarity. And so I suspect, if this was at the request of John Bolton, that there was some disagreement about reporting or roles and responsibilities.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. John Bolton's first day on the job as National Security Advisor was just yesterday. We know that he has a reputation as being particularly hawkish. Do we know if the two men differed in any way on their outlook when it came to foreign policy and domestic policy?
I don't look. I'm colleagues with both men. I had been colleagues with both men in the Bush administration. Think highly of both of them, frankly. Tom Bossert's views on foreign policy. One, I don't suspect they differ greatly from John Bolton's. But even if they did, the foreign policy views of the Homeland Security Advisor in terms of the policy-making process are not that important, frankly. You know, he has a lane he has to stay in. It does matter when you talk about terrorism, and we don't really know yet if they had a disagreement about who was going to handle the terrorism portfolio. But I don't suspect both men are conservative, policy-wise, and I don't suspect they would have had policy differences. I really have to think this would have been a bureaucratic dispute.
Yeah, because, I mean, just so our viewers understand, Fran, you also served as Homeland Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and you worked with Mr. Bossert, and you pointed out you worked with John Bolton. It does seem, just given the track record, the history of Mr. Bossert, that his views are not out of line with Mr. Bolton's views. And so, as we're all sort of trying to parse this out, I mean, it's sort of leaving a lot of people with heads scratching because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Right. Why, at this critical juncture, when the president is preparing to potentially meet with Kim Jong-un, when he's potentially weighing military action against Syria, when there's the immigration issue that needs to be really hammered out, why you would make a move like this at this point?
Yeah, and look, on the immigration issue, that falls largely into the portfolio of the Homeland Security Advisor. Tom Bossert clearly shares the president's view and Secretary Nielsen's views there, and has been a very strong advocate. Remember, the last time we deployed National Guard troops to the border was during the Bush administration, so Tom Bossert understood perfectly well how to do it, why to do it, and the effectiveness of doing it. And so, I mean, I would have thought, given the many foreign policy issues that Ambassador Bolton is going to have to deal with, that it would have been a relief to have somebody dealing with the sort of homeland and domestic issues. But again, you can't, frankly, let a disagreement over roles and responsibilities or reporting lines stand. It requires, if nothing else, you must have clarity there in the president's best interests. And so it's not possible to me that Ambassador Bolton would have acted without the president's agreement, and the vice president's for that matter. And so if it is right that Tom is resigning at the request of Ambassador Bolton, we have to presume that Ambassador Bolton requested that with the agreement and certainly the acquiescence of the president and the vice president.
So while we're sort of scratching our heads about this right now, Fran, should we anticipate other departures? Because, hey, like you said, when you've got sort of a new boss that comes in, things shift, things change, responsibilities shift, and maybe other people will leave as well.
Well, certainly, we under Michael Anton also resigned this week. I do think that on the National Security Council, you ought to expect changes. Ambassador Bolton is going to have to put in people there that share his views and that he has confidence and trust in. And so that's his right and his privilege to select his own staff. And so I do expect you will see, certainly on the National Security Council, a good deal of, some staff changes. This one, as Vlad said, this one is a little surprising, I think.
Fran, let's also tap your experience and knowledge as our CBS News national security analyst and ask you your thoughts on the potential military action that the president is weighing against Syria. It seems as if not only our allies, but both sides of the aisle when it comes to the Congress and the Senate feel that something should be done in Syria. The question, I guess, that is on a lot of people's mind is, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or right about this, that military action just for the sake of military action doesn't really do anything to dictators without a kind of coherent strategy for what will happen next, and whether that includes our allies, our partners, NATO, the UN, I'm not sure, but just to send some cruise missiles, certainly that is devastating for any country on the receiving end, but without any follow-up, what does that do?
Well, you're exactly right, Vlad. You need a more comprehensive strategy, and let's remember, Russia, there's a greater geopolitical landscape. This is not just a U.S. and Syria issue. You do need your allies. You do need NATO. You will have to. One of the reasons I believe the president would have said he needed 24 to 48 hours to think about it is you're consulting your regional allies, right? Israel, Lebanon, Jordan. You want to talk to folks in the region who are closest to it. You do want to have sort of a unified position and a long-term view to what you're trying to accomplish here. Look, none of our allies, none of our partners around the world want to see this attack just pass without some response. Because what it does is we become sort of used to the idea that this is acceptable, and it's not acceptable. It is a war crime. Assad ought to be ultimately tried for such a war crime that he's committed, and this is not the first time against his own people. Russia and Iran bear some responsibility for their propping up the Assad regime despite this latest chemical weapons attack. And all of that has got to be a part of the long-term strategy, considering Russia and Iran's complicity here has got to be part of that. And building a coalition takes time, right? It's difficult to do overnight. And I agree with you. Just launching a couple of TLAMs doesn't solve anything in the longer term. And
before we let you go, Fran, the president a couple of days ago, last week, suggested that he wanted to pull the United States out of Syria. In the past, he had criticized former administrations for what he called signaling of intention, of military plans, whether it was withdrawal or intentions to surge. Do you feel that perhaps Bashar al-Assad was emboldened when he heard the president say that he wanted to pull the United States out of Syria? And was it perhaps a mistake for the president to have criticized past administrations for talking about military plans sort of off the cuff? Vlad, look, I'm not going to. What you're really asking me is to get inside Assad's head and tell you what I think his motivations are. This is a man who's used chemical weapons in the past. He used them again. I mean, he's a war criminal, right? And so whether or not what President Trump said had any influence is, to me, of no moment right now. This is a man who has demonstrated his continued willingness to use weapons that have been banned internationally, and there must be repercussions to that.
We should point out that it was just last year that, in fact, the president did bomb as a result of a chemical attack, and clearly it didn't stop the chemical attacks, the alleged chemical attacks. Why wasn't, didn't President Obama attempt, at least with Russia, to get Mr. Assad to get rid of those chemical weapons? There's been a lot of talk about President Obama's line in the sand. You even had Madeleine Albright suggesting that she was disappointed that President Obama did not act on that red line in the sand. So that's something that criticism has come from both sides of the aisle. But I thought that part of the reason why Mr. Obama did that was he was hoping that the United States and Russia would be able to force Bashar al-Assad to get rid of that chemical weapons program, which they had for a long time in Syria. That's exactly right, Vlad. And the Russians sort of asserted that, in fact, they had done that. Working with the Assad regime, they had disbanded
the chemical weapons program in Syria. Clearly that was a lie, right? Because we know now they continue to have weapons that they're using against their own people. And so clearly Russia was not a reliable partner in terms of dissolving that chemical weapons program, and they can't be relied on, certainly going forward.
Fran, we love having you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to spend some time with us. I know we probably taxed you, but we really appreciate your expertise. That's why we love talking to you.
Thanks to both of you. Take care.
Take care, Fran. Thank you.